Ludmilla settled on a pier in the harbor of Lagos, next to a newly installed crane loading a barge with containers. A vampire bride adorned in a grey harbor staff uniform walked over to greet her with a polite bow. "Good evening, Lady Saradnik." "Good evening," Ludmilla replied. "How is everyone doing here?" "Things are going well, my lady," the vampire bride replied. "We have tea in the office if you'd like." "Thank you for your kind offer, but I just came from dinner. What is it that you're loading here?" The vampire bride turned her attention to the barge, watching a pair of Death Knights help guide a container into place. Unlike containers for processed and manufactured goods, which opened on one end, this one was effectively a large bin with a tarp secured over it. They were bulk containers meant to hold grain, stone, timber and other raw materials. "This is one of the transports designated to deliver materials for road construction," the vampire bride said. "Now that the harbor infrastructure is installed, we've been collecting rubble from the outskirts of the city." "The elder liches have already finished their survey?" "No, my lady," the vampire bride shook her head. "They've barely covered 5% of the city area. The rubble approved for clearing is delivered to a location closer to the highway's current point of progress for processing." In hindsight, the elder liches should have started their survey of the ancient capital in the southwestern quarter, which was mostly leveled. Even that much wouldn't come close to covering the entire Katza highway network, however. Fortunately, the excavation of subterranean chambers for her indoor farming project would provide a steady flow of materials once they got started. "How far is the highway now?" Ludmilla asked. "I didn't see anything, I cut straight across to Lagos." "We're about 50 kilometers from the Corlin County border at the moment. The terrain is providing some major challenges and we don't have nearly enough materials." "What sort of challenges?" In a word, the Katza Plains is very flat. Lady Schultia wanted the new highway to follow the river as it does in Corlin County, but that proved problematic. The embankments on both sides of the river have long been eroded away. When spring came, the river flooded and washed away the road as well. The terrain is so even that the flooding went a few kilometers into the surrounding plains in some places. Now that she mentioned it, Ludmilla recalled that the surviving city ruins along the river that His Majesty had visited were all constructed with the spring floods in mind. In Lagos, even though the river was broader than in Corlin County, the water level was a meter or so higher than when they visited in the autumn. "What have you done to address the issue?" Ludmilla asked. "At first," the vampire bride answered, "Lord Mayor dredged up material from the river bottom to build a new embankment. But silt and mud make for a poor foundation. In the end, we scaled up our road-laying techniques until the ground was high and stable enough to support the road." "I'm afraid to ask how high the highway is now." "Not too high, my lady. We found that a height of 3 meters was enough. We've only built up the northern bank, so the river floods further out on the southern side as the water level rises. Since we're dumping material on flooded land, it looks like we're building a jetty rather than a road." "I wish I had stopped to look now," Ludmilla said. "How?" A wraith floated by and suddenly turned to attack her. She hurriedly dispatched it, but that only attracted all of the undead in the vicinity. A few minutes later, she had destroyed all of the naturally spawned undead in a 40-meter radius, including all of the aquatic ones that came out of the water for her. The vampire bride had assumed a defensive stance, looking about in confusion. What happened?" "I left my ring of non-detection on and dropped my concealment when I entered the harbor." "Oh," the vampire bride rose and smoothed her garments. "Is being undead truly something one needs to hide, my lady?" Ludmilla removed the ring and put it away. She eyed the vampire bride's pale features and glowing crimson eyes. Her pristine skin and generous figure exuded an aura of sensuous beauty that would surely win her the amorous regard of most. That regard would last for about as long as they didn't realize that she was a vampire. Once they did, she would be regarded as a predatory abomination. "I don't believe that it's anything to be ashamed of," Ludmilla said. "But, at the same time, the undead don't enjoy a very good reputation amongst the living. Around here, at least. I've heard of cities ruled by undead elsewhere and there is apparently more undead activity in the distant south, so different parts of the world might have different views about us. For now, however, I must assume that being recognized as an undead being by the living will result in obstacles to His Majesty's wishes forming." "That's a shame," the vampire bride sighed. While I care little for what outsiders think of us, it is frustrating to have their opinions impede our duties. Even with those around D. Ranthal, sometimes I feel that His Majesty's benevolence goes unappreciated. Lady Shiltier shared her feelings with me on the matter not long after we met, Ludmilla said. All I could say at the time was that it was instinctual behavior. After my visit to the Empire, however, I think that another part of it is simply the lot of a ruler. What do you mean by that, my lady? One last container was loaded onto the barge and locked into place before the Death Knight dockworkers shuttered the hold. Shortly after they hopped off, the barge started to drift away. Ludmilla walked off of the pier with the vampire bride beside her. The thoughts of individuals never perfectly match up, Ludmilla explained. One who presides over many individuals must account for this fact and ensure that those under them are unified in a greater purpose. At the same time, they must accept that there will always be, well, dissent is too strong a word, but it might be the best way to put it. It is not active disagreement, but people acting as they believe they should. Ah, this much I think I can understand, the vampire bride nodded. Lady Shiltier often gives us orders and we are left to figure things out on our own. Even though we work to carry out her wishes, we are often left wondering how. Those moments are becoming fewer. I believe we owe much of this to you and the others who have entered into our mistress' service. Most of your thanks should go to Lady Shiltier, Ludmilla replied. It seems that she never receives recognition for this, but she is an excellent liege. In human society, it is common for those in power to cling to as much of it as they can. Pride and insecurity lead to them doling out rights and responsibilities like some sort of petty miser. Talent and ambition possessed by others are perceived as threats. Lady Shiltier is nearly the opposite in this regard. She has more than her fair share of pride, but, at the same time, she has learned how to harness that pride to further her goals. Individuals of talent and ambition are precious treasures to be gathered, polished and put to work. Trust is difficult to earn, but once it is earned it is given wholly. She shares her insecurities and is secure enough in herself to ask questions about what she is unfamiliar with and entrust qualified individuals to crucial tasks. By doing so, she has created a structure that not only supports her, but benefits all who are a part of it. We are all very proud of our mistress, the vampire bride nodded. Even His Majesty has displayed his recognition for how much she has grown since, back then. Our lives were so simple before, to be honest, we were anxious about whether we could do what was asked of us. Now, we are given so many opportunities to serve that it feels like a dream. Ludmilla wasn't sure whether they were all turned by Lady Shiltier or came into her service through some other means, but, like the Death Series servitors, it seemed that the vampire brides prioritized service to Lady Shiltier and the Sorcerer King above all else. Because of her interactions with the more emotional and expressive vampire brides, however, Ludmilla was provided with another important window into the perspectives of the undead and how they lived their lives. As they walked along the harborfront, they left the area cleared of undead. Ludmilla eyed the variety of mindless beings standing at or near the places where they had probably spawned. The wild undead don't get in the way of operations? She asked. We move those ones away, the vampire bride answered. This is happening on the constructed stretches of the highway as well. Will we not have issues with undead spawning inside containers and such? We haven't noticed anything of the sort so far, my lady. The undead spawn where they are supposed to spawn. I see. Where they are supposed to spawn was related to a concept that His Majesty had shared with her back on their autumn excursion. This concept proposed that the undead manifested in forms suited to their locales. The ruins of settlements and the cats of plains spawned undead which reflected what one would find in that settlement. First would come the undead that represented residents in the form of skeletons and zombies. Sometimes, they manifested with the tools of their trade. As the settlement populated with undead, a larger variety would begin to appear. Undead beasts took on the role of livestock. Skeleton archers and skeleton spearmen were the village militia. If the build-up of undead was substantial enough, more named figures would appear. A patrol sergeant might be a ghast or wraith. A village chief might appear as a ghoul or a wight. Veteran soldiers or other accomplished warriors would appear as skeleton warriors. A school might contain a skeleton mage or an alip as a teacher. Negative energy had distinctive patterns of behavior that gave those who were familiar with them pause. Undeath relied on life to give it form, or it at least seemed to take the shape of what came before. What about vermin? Ludmilla asked. Vermin, my lady? Things that are known to infest or stow away with cargo, rats and such. The vampire bride's petite nose wrinkled in disgust. Maybe we should keep our facilities cleared, after all. Undead beasts in the form of rats would be a major threat to the average human. I'll have some death priests sweep through the warehouses and containers here just in case they've already appeared. In that case, I should let you get started. We should be starting soon in the Draconic Kingdom. Oh my, how exciting. I wish you the best of luck, my lady. Ludmilla smiled as she parted ways with the vampire bride, who hurried off to find a death priest. While Lady Shiltir and her handmaidens had a variety of interests, most of the Sorceress Kingdom's undead, be they servitors or otherwise, did not get excited about much. The one thing that universally made them more lively was the idea that they were serving the Sorcerer King in some capacity. Over the course of the past year, Ludmilla's work not only involved helping the undead acclimate to their roles around the Sorceress Kingdom, but also helping them understand how others fit into the grand scheme of things. By doing so, she hoped to have them appear less alien to the living subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom while at the same time helping them understand one another. This was an extension, or perhaps it would be more accurately considered one of the foundations, of her effort to help develop a national culture suited for the Sorceress Kingdom. While the Sorceress Kingdom had adopted the laws of Riestais, which was an entirely human country, Prime Minister Albedo worked tirelessly to amend those laws to accommodate the reality of a multiracial state. Just as other races could not reasonably be expected to conform to legislation meant for humans, so too would culture have to change. Unlike legislation and criminal codes, which could be enforced through raw power, culture was not so simple. Furthermore, there was a disturbing trend amongst the Sorceress Kingdom's subjects that did not bode well for its cultural development. The problem was delivered via two major vectors. First was the fact that the vast majority of the Sorceress Kingdom's citizens came from a life of subsistence, which included direct competition over resources. That life had come to an abrupt end with the unprecedented agricultural output and absolute power brought about with the advent of the new state. For the most part, the general opinion of life in the Sorceress Kingdom was an amalgamation of "we aren't starving, no one is trying to eat us and nothing will threaten our lives." The seemingly idyllic conditions were hardly anything to complain about, but it presented a point that was first brought up with her by Moranbor nearly a year previous. They had everything they needed, but they did not have what they needed for when they had everything they needed. Back then, it was in reference to the proposal that he made on behalf of his colleagues in Zernorn, but Ludmilla thought it was a good way to consider the future in general. As with humans, one could not simply expect a member of any race to be content just because they were no longer struggling to survive. This reality had not hit the Sorceress Kingdom yet because the majority of its citizens were just starting to digest their new circumstances. The initial sentiment was security was all that mattered, but they would soon discover that this was not the case. With the time that they had, Ludmilla and several others were attempting to preempt the problem or at least facilitate what would come next. Except it was an unbelievably complex problem to approach. If one asked a member from each race dwelling in the Sorceress Kingdom what was good or desirable or even entertaining, one would receive just as many answers. There was no single, convenient solution. Both Ludmilla and Florian asserted that the solution did not even come from a single source. A piece of the answer had to be provided by each race and culture. At its core, however, was the idea that it needed to serve as a unifying force for every citizen of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. One that went beyond basic needs or absolute power. This in turn led to the idea of a national spirit in the form of shared values and central ideologies. Even a novice in politics understood that the vast majority of people did not follow a sense of shared values and ideologies, but what represented those values and ideologies to them. People did not follow a cause, they followed the embodiment of that cause. In the Sorcerer's Kingdom, the ultimate embodiment of that cause was the Sorcerer King. Following leaders was natural to most of what Ludmilla termed social races and also applied to beings capable of understanding social constructs. This led to the second vector through which the ongoing problem was being delivered. Few understood what was embodied by the Sorcerer King beyond the idea that his power ensured their survival and enforced order. In short, the Sorcerer's Kingdom was a colossal mass of unrealized and undirected potential. This was more than a bit disturbing since it meant they could end up going in any direction and the direction would herald unsolicited precedents for the nation's character. The first step to ensuring that the Sorcerer's Kingdom's character didn't blow around like a leaf in the wind was finding common points to anchor it to. To Ludmilla, one of the major and obvious cornerstones were the Sorcerer King's vassals and servitors. Their unfailing, undying devotion to the Sorcerer King could serve as a guidepost for the citizenry. Before it could be used as such, however, connections to the citizenry had to be made. As with Lady Shiltia's vampire brides, they were issued instructions but often struggled to carry them out in ways that required a certain level of understanding. A wider sense of cause and effect was entirely absent in a newly created undead servitor. Tangible and intangible collateral damage occurred as a result. To solve this, Ludmilla decided to use the empathy inherent to all undead servitors as one of the starting points for cultural development. This was not the empathy of humans or even living things, of course, but empathy tied to their sense of devotion to the Sorcerer King. For instance, if a death knight damaged a farmer's property while fulfilling some other duty, the farmer might complain about a loss of livelihood. This complaint would not get the farmer anywhere. The death knight would not care and the local undead administrator would simply advise them to repair or replace their losses. No reparations or apologies would be made unless they were prescribed, and those would simply be carried out as a cold and sterile procedure. An effective appeal framed the event in terms of how it affected one's contribution to the Sorcerer King's nation. The results would then become horrifying to the Death Knight because damage to the farmer's livelihood led to a loss of productivity. That loss of productivity led to a loss in tax revenues and was ultimately detrimental to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Ensuring that the Death Series servitors understood how the activities of the citizenry fulfilled the wishes of their master ensured that they did nothing to alienate the citizenry and instead be embraced by its communities. These associations also cultivated a form of respect. Those who served the Sorcerer King were admirable people, it was just a matter of knowing in what capacity they served so that all might better serve His Majesty as a whole. It was this concept that she thought would serve as a powerful anchor for the culture that developed in the Sorcerer's Kingdom and thus the character of its people. The Sorcerer King desired a nation that served as a beacon of harmony and prosperity for all the world to see. His Majesty would be the embodiment of the ideals and values that went into such a nation, the cause that every citizen of the Sorcerer's Kingdom ultimately served. The tread of bony feet sounded through the mist before a set of the royal army's elder liches came into view. Behind them was a column of red skeleton warriors. They stopped their patrol in front of her, offering a salute. "Good evening," Ludmilla returned their salute. "Good evening, Lady Zaradnik," the elder lich in the lead said. "Any luck?" she asked. "Unfortunately not," the elder lich answered with a sigh. "Of the undead observed to spawn in the city, skeletal dragons are the rarest amongst mindless undead. Since the expansion of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's borders over the Katza Plains, the elder liches of the Royal Army had enacted a practice that they called spawn camping. The negative energy wasteland manifested a variety of undead beings and the elder liches systematically patrolled the region in search of rare and useful ones. "So much for convenient flying mounts," Ludmilla smirked. "How goes the rest of our harvest?" "As ordered, we have divided our forces into the contingents you have prescribed. If you have come, does that mean our operation will begin soon?" "Countess Corlin will be meeting with Prime Minister Albedo in the morning," Ludmilla replied. "The situation has developed more rapidly than expected, so I expect that we will be authorized to begin within the day. How are things looking on the border?" "At last report," the elder lich replied, "little of note has occurred. The frontier along the Draconic Kingdom border has shown no signs of activity and those sent to monitor the Katza River Delta have not seen traffic or any signs of crossing to or from the slain theocracy. Patrols from Altamura similarly show no alterations in their schedule." Ludmilla crossed her arms, frowning as the elder lich relayed what it knew. She thought it unlikely that the slain theocracy wouldn't move if it knew what was going on. Even if the head of state was of draconic ancestry, the Draconic Kingdom had a human population somewhere in the vicinity of 7 million. To suddenly lapse in its centuries-long vigil protecting humanity in the region would be extraordinarily odd. She understood that the war with the Elf Kingdom might be placing strain on the theocracy's military resources, but the scriptures could still be dispatched to turn the tide in the Draconic Kingdom without needing to divert the army from their war effort. What she was left with was the notion that the Beastman Kingdom was preventing any information from escaping while they secured the Draconic Kingdom. At the same time, she wasn't sure how that was possible. It was unlikely that the Draconic Kingdom had an utter lack of magic casters. Like every human country aside from the slain theocracy, the Adventurer Guild operated within the Draconic Kingdom. All they had to do was pay an adventurer caster to send a message spell. Alternatively, since message was considered untrustworthy, they could have someone fly over. The Draconic Kingdom should have temples of various faiths as well, and they would surely be calling for help if the worst had come to pass. If you were to interdict an entire country, Ludmilla asked the Elder Liches, how would you do it? The Elder Liches exchanged glances with one another. After several moments, the patrol leader spoke again. Unless the country is 1/4 the size of the Duchy of Urantal, it said, there is no practical way to maintain a blockade with the methods currently available to the Royal Army. Is there any way to stop message spells? Not that we know of. However, one must be familiar with the recipient of a message spell to contact them. They couldn't be that insular, could they? As a former subject of Riestais, she probably didn't have any right to be critical of another nation's level of magical integration, but even Riestais had a handful of people in every city capable of magical communication. How could it have become like that? Ludmilla muttered. If I may ask, my lady, what is the situation in the Draconic Kingdom? They're almost entirely overrun, Ludmilla replied. Our strategic objectives haven't changed, but we're going to be fighting a very different war than I expected. This may be presumptuous, the Elder Lich said, but I do not believe defeat is possible with the assembled forces. Perhaps not, but how we win is what is important here. We have a reputation to build. As far as the Southeastern Theater is concerned, that reputation needs to be a good one. Have the others assemble south of the city? At once, my lady. The Elder Liches saluted once more before continuing on their way and turning south at the nearest corner. Ludmilla activated her hairpin and flew up between the tall spires of lagers. She idly watched the now pristine limestone buildings go by below as she mulled over how she could approach their strategic issues. With the majority of the Draconic Kingdom under Beastman occupation, the initial assumption that they would be fighting to break an enemy army's advance and pushing them back out was no longer valid. Assuming every population center had become a farm, her counteroffensive would now consist of thousands of smaller battles to root out the Beastmen and liberate the Draconic Kingdom's territories. The Draconic Kingdom had been treated as a hunting preserve for all these years. With recent developments, its citizens had been turned into livestock. Now, the question was what would happen once the Sorceress Kingdom's forces entered the fray. She had a sense that the Beastmen would first react by trying to defend their newly acquired territory. They had gone through the effort of keeping everything intact and getting their new agricultural operations going, after all. The question was what the Draconic Kingdom's citizens would do. Once things started to go poorly for the Beastmen, would humans go from little fodder to battle fodder? Would they fight alongside the Beastmen in common cause against the undead? If the Beastmen abandoned their holdings, would the humans be taken with them? They might even beg to be brought along. Many strange superstitions revolved around the undead, such as having one's soul stolen, so living as livestock was a preferable fate. The captives might cooperate with their captors to fight against or escape from their liberators. It was an utterly ridiculous scenario from Ludmilla's end, but entirely plausible. She couldn't think of a way to prevent it from happening without also risking retaliation against the captive citizens. Perhaps the solution would come to her once she had more information. Ludmilla flew past the southern outskirts of the city, descending closer to the ground. The environment made it impossible to see more than a few dozen meters, but she imagined it would be difficult to miss the Royal Army's forces. After flying for another kilometer, orderly ranks of undead became visible in the mist. She skimmed over them, looking for the head of the formation. After a minute or so, she found the front ranks, which were composed of Death Series servitors. Landing in front of a lone Elder Lich standing in front of the army, she exchanged a salute. Baroness Saradnik, the Elder Lich said. This one is known as Psycho. I have been assigned to serve as your adjutant for the duration of this campaign. It's a pleasure to meet you, Psycho, Ludmilla replied. How are we looking? Our exercises have found no issues with control, though many of the companies are as flimsy as one would expect. Each Elder Lich has procured their domination limit in locally sourced undead. Were they able to find enough of the ones I wanted? Yes, my lady, the Elder Lich nodded. Over the past few months, we have secured 400 red skeleton warriors, 2,000 skeleton warriors, 200 blood meat hulks, 400 bone vultures, 400 skeleton mages, 2,000 assorted undead beasts, 600 ghasts, 1,000 wraiths, 2,000 ghouls, 1,000 wights and 10,000 low-level skeletons and zombies. A total of 20,000 undead for 100 red counterfeiters, which were level 35 elder liches. With the exception of Death Knights, created undead could not create additional permanent undead even if their naturally spawned counterparts could. What they could do was use their undead domination skills. There were level limits and numerical limits, but red skeleton warriors, the strongest of the undead collected, were well within the level limit. There were proposals to employ dominated undead in the Sorcerous Kingdom's industries, but if an Elder Lich somehow died or otherwise lost control of them, a massacre would result. They would also have to be cautious that it didn't happen while they were using dominated undead forces in the Draconic Kingdom. What about our reserves? They are increasingly infrequent the higher the level. Everything below skeleton warriors is effectively unlimited. There are less than 100 red skeleton warriors in reserve. Did the experiments with undead density produce any notable results? Unfortunately not, Psycho replied. The undead we've gathered were collected into these ranks over a small area, but the spawning patterns remain unchanged. It appeared that there was a flaw in the common idea that the accumulation of undead led to the appearance of stronger undead. Proof required further investigation, but Ludmilla felt that what the Sorcerer King had shared with her was the actual truth. The natural accumulation of negative energy and the resulting undead led to a progression that reflected what had previously occupied the area. Furthermore, once that accumulation reached the limit of the local theme, an advanced negative energy ecology manifested, which introduced a chance of producing exotic undead. Are our regular army squads ready as well? Yes, my lady. 2 cavalry squads and 1 infantry company await your command. Good, Ludmilla nodded. Then let's get into position. 8th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 0800 hours. Stop with your grouchy face. Moo. And the lizardman noise. Clara smiled to herself as Florian poked Leanne in the arm. After a long night of reviewing and updating their preparations, they had departed Corlin Harbor in a set of carriages to Eranthal. Chief Venomscale and his entourage were in the vehicle following theirs. I wanted to see, Leanne pouted. I don't know why you take such great pleasure in watching others react to things, Florian said. I'm sure it will get you in trouble one of these days. Gay, where's your noble pride? Leanne said, we all did our little part in building up the Sorcerous Kingdom, why wouldn't you want to see how other people react to what they see here? That's not the main thing you're looking out for, Florian frowned at her friend. You just want to watch them squirm and jump at every little thing. It's not something you can do forever. Can too. Their carriage passed through the gates of Eranthal and up its winding streets. At the same time the previous year, the city had been paralyzed in fear of their new ruler. Now, it felt more vibrant than when it was a part of Riastais. The city's population hadn't fully recovered to its original numbers, but it was merely a matter of time before the improved quality of life and lower cost of living led to unprecedented growth. Clara still didn't know what the royal court ultimately had planned to accommodate that growth, but there were plenty of near-term options. Eranthal's most obvious change would have to be the zoning of the city. At the same time, this meant that everything had to change accordingly. Clara suspected that they would start with the horribly tiny gates and the ridiculous layout of its infrastructure. If they were going to redo the roads, that meant they should also redo the water and sanitation systems. That, in turn, would lead to an evaluation of building codes and standardization of construction for everything. Clara sighed. The advances brought about by the advent of the Sorcerous Kingdom made any legacy infrastructure, buildings and even fortifications obsolete. When it came to anything inherited from Riastais, it felt that change would come in an all-or-nothing form. This invariably meant an endless cycle of committee meetings with the royal court which continually planned, replanned, amended and added things to everything because nothing was too good for the Sorcerer King's capital and no expense was spared. Where were you going to take them first? Clara asked. Are you sure you don't want us to be there with you? Leanne asked back. We can't just make Chief Venomscale wait around, Clara told her. I have no idea how long this meeting will take and it would be both rude and foolish to give the impression that he isn't important anymore now that he's delivered what we asked him for. You and Florian are responsible for ensuring that the groundwork you've laid with the Wyvern Rider tribes develops in the Sorcerous Kingdom's favor. Tell us what you're gonna say, at least. I think this new information speaks for itself, Clara replied. His Majesty's royal court isn't staffed with blithering idiots. That's true, Florine said, but at the same time, what they consider an emergency may not be what you expect. The rise and fall of a nation may simply be one of many such events in the life of immortal beings. Ludmilla and Florine were very good at figuring out other races, so Clara couldn't deny that Florine's line of thought might be true. If there was one thing she had come to learn since the annexation of Irantal, it was that other races were not humans. While it sounded obvious enough, it was a difficult notion to even partially wrap one's head around. No matter what, humans framed their thoughts in ways related to themselves. This made it all too easy to come to the wrong conclusions about how others perceived the world, what defined their values and how they would react to things. Even when one made a correct assumption about a reaction, they could be wrong at the same time, since the underlying nature of another race could result in the same response for entirely different reasons. For Clara, interracial relations was a difficult field where rational thought could hurt as much as it helped. Do you have any specific worries? Clara asked. Something's not quite right, Florine answered. But that feeling is about the whole rather than any particular part. While the current state of the Draconic Kingdom is a surprise, I have a sense that it isn't the last nor the biggest surprise that will come our way. I hate it when she does that, Leanne muttered. Clara could only laugh helplessly in response. The worst part about it was that Florine was probably right, and they wouldn't have a better idea of why that was until they had more information to work with, at which point they would be close to or past too late. We've made all the preparations that we reasonably can, Clara said. Whatever is going to happen, the four of us will be facing it together. Leanne and Florine put on brave smiles at her words. She smiled back, wondering if they were doing it for each other or themselves. A bunch of teenagers going into international politics. We must be crazy. Perhaps a princess of a royal house or imperial dynasty would serve as a representative of their nation, but they were simply regular noble women. Minor trade negotiations were the extent of their experience, yet events had catapulted them onto the regional stage. At the same time, however, life did not conveniently wait for one to be perfectly ready. Their carriage slowed to a stop just outside the main plaza. A footman opened the door and a wave of heat from the sun-baked pavement rolled into the cabin along with the sounds of the mid-morning markets. Leanne and Florine made last-minute checks over one another's appearances. Do you think they'll buy anything? Clara asked. Oh, they'll buy stuff, Leanne answered. The question is whether the stuff that they buy will lead to them buying more stuff. The Wyvern Rider tribes are a small market, but every trade relationship we open up gives us that much more credibility and clout. They all knew this, of course. Impressing the importance of an impending task was just Leanne's way of mentally preparing for an upcoming battle. Clara leaned to look out of the door after they'd disembarked. Chief Venomscale and his party were already standing on the street, heads turning all about themselves as if gauging the surroundings for potential threats. They had politely turned down the selection of outfits that had been provided to them, preferring their sturdy wyvern scale leathers. Florine turned and waved to Clara with an encouraging smile before Leanne led them into the crowded plaza. Do we need to stop at the city manor for anything, my lady? The footman asked. No, Clara answered, we'll head straight to the royal villa. We can't be late for a court appointment. She leaned back into her seat as her carriage continued on its way. Despite Clara's assurances to her friends, even the smallest doubts had her see countless pitfalls on the path ahead of them. Chief Venomscale's report was bad enough, but now Florine's sense that something was broadly amiss suggested that an obscuring veil lay over everything. But why had Florine chosen this specific point in time to bring up her concerns? Her interactions with Leanne aside, Florine was generally content to only act when she felt that it mattered. Like Ludmilla, Florine almost seemed spontaneous and arbitrary, but they were always onto something when they allowed their intuition to guide them. Florine's note about the royal court unsettled Clara the most. Possibly because she was on her way to meet them. If one directly asked her what her approach to dealing with a cadre of supremely powerful and hyper-competent immortal beings was, she would have no coherent answer for them. There was simply no frame of reference to use for someone who, up until a year ago, had only interacted with humans and was a human herself. A human. If what Ludmilla mentioned to them played out, they wouldn't be humans for much longer. Perhaps that was why Florine's words bothered her so. By considering how various heteromorphic beings perceived and interacted with the world, she was conducting a mental exercise on what it was like to be one of them. Becoming something else was probably not as superficial as changing into a new dress. Some of her musings were akin to what children might think of wings with which one could fly, or fantastic new abilities. Strength, speed and durability beyond the limits of humanity. Innate magic or curious quirks. What would it be like to have a tail? An extra set of arms or legs? What if she could lay eggs? Beyond those whimsical thoughts, however, lurked the more disturbing realities that they might have to face. Would a transformation into some predatory race similarly transform the way she saw the people around her? If Tara came in as she usually did to wake her from her rest, would Clara eye her from her bed and wrestle with the urge to feed on her flesh? Would she wrestle with that urge at all? Maybe she would simply devour her and think nothing of it. As Ludmilla always asserted, every being had a nature inherent to it. If changed into such a being, how would that nature affect her? Did becoming a demon or devil bring with it the desire to commit acts of evil? Would becoming a dragon bring with it a dragon's storied pride? Then there was the one thing common to them all, immortality. While it was probably common for people to wish for a limitless lifespan, how would one who was once immortal ever come to terms with it? Once or twice, she had discussed Ludmilla's undead existence with her, half afraid of the answers. While she kept telling herself that Ludmilla was still the same person as before, Clara could tell that her childhood friend had indeed changed. The greatest of those changes was that Ludmilla was more Ludmilla than she was as a human. One might attribute this to her experiences since the annexation and how they served as stepping stones to adulthood. Ludmilla's amplified fervor over the descent of their god probably also had something to do with it. Clara thought that something else besides that was going on, though. Ludmilla was still the Ludmilla she knew and loved, but, at the same time, she was somehow more. Other changes were understandable when one considered her new reality. Generally speaking, Ludmilla did not have the physical needs of the living but still participated as one of them. She ate meals with them and drank socially. Clara supposed that the former would count as eating socially. No matter how much or little she ate or drank, however, she never gained or lost weight. Clara was fairly certain that Ludmilla had stopped growing by the time that she had become undead, and her physical fitness was what one would expect of a martial noble, so it amounted to an enviable appearance that required no maintenance. Undead were physically tireless, so Ludmilla was quickly separating from that aspect of her human existence. She could run forever, carry a silly amount of weight forever, hold a bow drawn forever and fight forever. Both she and Lady Sheltier claimed that the undead still experienced mental fatigue, but Ludmilla's mental fortitude had always been absurd. Taking breaks had effectively become optional. When she was left to her own devices, the closest thing to taking breaks were relaxing activities such as training or mostly work-related reading. The need for rest had already been mitigated by her ring of sustenance while she was human, so not sleeping at all was not that far of a leap. Like eating and drinking, sleep had become a social activity. Ludmilla claimed that she did sleep on her own when there was nothing better to do, but since there was always something to do, Clara suspected that she never slept unless she was sleeping with others. For those whose interactions with her were temporary, or those that kept a respectful, or fearful, distance from her, Ludmilla was effectively human. The rumors and opinions that surrounded her only served to reinforce her characterization in the eyes of strangers. She was the way she was because that was how she always was, and those who knew of her could vouch for that, so nothing at all about her suggested that she was no longer what she once was. In a way, Clara supposed that Ludmilla had become more like her friends, who cultivated an image for themselves and employed it as a tool for their interactions. She didn't do it on purpose, however. A noble's mask usually incorporated bits of one's true self to maintain an air of believability. Ludmilla's mask was not used to convince others of anything. Instead, it was a sample of the whole of what she was. If one removed her mask, they would find more of the same in greater quantities. Of immortality, Ludmilla shared very little. In her words, one had to be immortal to truly grasp the realities of immortality. It was like a child attempting to understand what it was like to be an adult. Anything they could come up with fell far short. Their minds and bodies weren't developed to the same point and, as a result, even their experiences were perceived differently. At the same time, a child did not suddenly become an adult one day and understand the whole of what it was. Ludmilla claimed that she was akin to a child when it came to her being a heteromorphic being, but what she understood so far suggested that growing as one would similarly influence her perception of the world. Even she didn't know where her journey as a revenant would take her. What she did know was that many of the changes were not a result of conscious choice, but simply the result of her new state of being and all that it encompassed. If Clara applied Ludmilla's case to herself, being transformed into a heteromorph meant that she would remain Clara Corlin, yet be subject to the realities brought on by her new state of being. Somewhere in between would lie what she would eventually become. Having so many unknowns before her made that future a frightening prospect. Ludmilla was lucky in the sense that, while she was not of the same race as her, Lady Shiltia served as a mentor to the realities of being undead. The Sorcerer King, too, had helped Ludmilla explore the changes brought about by her transformation. There were plenty of other intelligent undead around as well, so rather than being alone amongst humans, she had a sort of community waiting for her when she turned into one of the undead. Clara could only hope that there would at least be someone of whatever type of heteromorph she turned into to mentor her as well. The carriage stopped in front of the royal villa. Clara cleared away her wandering thoughts. Attempting to make some last-minute analysis of the royal court and its motives would get her nowhere and possibly result in harm. At the entrance, the familiar smile of Miss Alpha greeted her. "Good morning, Countess Corlin." The royal maid lowered herself into a perfect curtsy. "Good morning, Miss Alpha," Clara smiled in return. "It's been a long time since we last saw one another, though I should have expected you to be the one to receive me." Nearly 3 months, to be precise. Yuri Alpha played an active role in the development of the Sorceress Kingdom's social welfare and public education systems, so she was someone that Clara interacted with often in her pursuit of the same goals. She was a stern, yet undeniably good and caring woman, proof that the undead were not the arbitrarily evil beings that many thought them to be. "The royal court is convening as we speak," Miss Alpha said. "Are you prepared for your audience?" "Yes." Clara patted the infinite haversack on her hip. "Everything's in here. I delivered a summary with my request for an audience, but knowing the Prime Minister, she is expecting a more comprehensive presentation." The royal maid led her into the villa, through a set of immaculate hallways to the chambers of the royal court. Miss Alpha glanced toward her when they reached the solid double doors and Clara nodded in return. She seated herself while the royal maid entered to announce her arrival. At this point, many would nervously review what they had to come to speak about, but so many preparations and plans had been made over the past year that there was no need. Ultimately, they had a single, overarching objective: incorporate the Draconic Kingdom into the Sorceress Kingdom's hegemony. In front of her, the double doors opened and Yuri Alpha appeared again. "Countess Corlin," she said. "The royal court will see you now." A magical spotlight cast its harsh glare over the wide table in the middle of the royal court's chambers. Covering the length and breadth of that table was a map of the Duchy of Eranthal. The map had changed much since the territory's annexation nearly a year previous, and much of that change had been precipitated by a single man. That man stood to her right, wearing the jet-black armor that had become renowned across the land, Merman of Darkness, or rather, Pandora's Actor. "Have you any idea what this is about?" Albedo asked. "I do not," Pandora's Actor answered. "But if it is Countess Corlin, only one thing should elicit a request for an audience from her, should it not?" "The ludicrousness of these lower life forms always leaves room for doubt," Albedo snorted. "The administration receives ridiculous petitions with such regularity that I wonder if these natives are cursed to fill some arbitrary quota of stupidity." Pandora's Actor's deep chuckle drew a frown from Albedo. "What's so funny?" "I was just thinking that if the world always worked according to one's whims," the doppelganger replied, "it might be a very boring place. Variety is the spice of life, is it not? That is why our master encourages us to seek out new experiences and learn from them. I've had enough new experiences to frustrate me for the next decade, thank you very much." "Ma, there should be no worries on our end this time. Countess Corlin is one actor that plays her role well. Any unwelcome native developments should be external, yes?" That was the most likely case. In fact, all unwelcome native developments of note had been exclusively external. Albedo worked hard to ensure that the Sorceress Kingdom's internal affairs were always in order. The door at the far end of the hall opened and Yuri Alpha walked before them. "Countess Corlin has arrived," she said. "Who is in her party?" Albedo asked. No one, Albedo-sama, Yuri replied. She has come alone. Bring her in. Certainly. As Yuri departed the room, Pandora's actor raised a hand to his chin in a thoughtful gesture. What is it? Albedo asked. It is uncharacteristic for Corlin to appear alone for an appointment with the royal court, Pandora's actor replied. She is not one to monopolize achievements, it is usually the opposite. Representatives for all relevant interests are sure to receive their due. Well, this audience did come with little warning. The door opened again and Yuri Alpha led the human noblewoman before them. Countess Corlin sported the cobalt and silver colors of her house, though the dress itself was equipment from Yggdrasil, a set of low-level equipment composed of item frames fashioned from adamantite, minor data crystals and weak accessories. It was what was deemed suitable to protect assets that had been developed out of the Sorceress Kingdom's population, and several of Shiltia's vassals were among those who were bestowed that equipment. Countess Corlin's amethyst eyes scanned the hall as she came toward them. Aside from herself, Pandora's actor and Yuri Alpha, Pestonia was the only other person present. The human noblewoman stopped several meters from the table and lowered herself into a deep curtsy. Lady Albedo, she said, thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice. You mentioned that new information from the southeast calls for the immediate execution of your plans. Yes, my lady, Countess Corlin's heels tapped over the floor as she came forward. We have received a fresh reconnaissance report of the Draconic Kingdom's situation. The human noblewoman reached into her infinite haversack and started laying pages of a map over the table. Pandora's actor crossed his arms as they examined the array of documents spread out over the table. Though Albedo didn't have a doppelganger's ability to detect thoughts, she could already tell what was probably going through his mind. It was a conclusion that anyone created by the Supreme Beings would come to. A conclusion considered a matter of course, for all had no choice but to dance like puppets in the palm of their master's hand. The stage was set. Pandora's actor's unique perspective on matters had served him well in his role as both the Dark Warrior and the Royal Treasurer. This, too, could be said to be the purposeful product of his creator's will. Albedo worked down a twinge of jealousy. He was the NPC created by the greatest of the Supreme Beings, a distinction that others could never claim. Was it due to this that he had obtained such spectacular success? Though flamboyant and given to bouts of dramatic flair, he was somehow humble at the same time, never holding his achievements over those of the others. Much like his creator, he downplayed his contributions, masking his superlative ability. Don't you think this is more than a bit out of line with your initial assessments, Lady Corlin? Albedo asked. They are, Countess Corlin nodded. Fortunately, Baroness Zaradnik possessed the presence of mind to request a reconnaissance report when she met with Countess Wagner and Baroness Gonnier in the wildlands south of the Empire. A map indicative of the Beastman Kingdom's strategy, Gem, Pandora's actor said. That was Baroness Zaradnik's assessment, yes, Countess Corlin replied. Apologies for the interruption, Pestonia raised a hand. But I am afraid that I am not very good at reading maps. What does it say about their strategy? 1. Albedo turned to Pestonia with a slight smile on her lips. The citizens of the Draconic Kingdom are being integrated into their neighbor's economy, Albedo told her, as agricultural products. The headmaid's mouth worked silently in shock. Several moments passed before she finally gained the presence of mind to bring a gloved hand up to cover it. This is terrible, she said. We need to help them right away. 1. How long has it taken for them to reach this state? Pandora's actor asked. We're not certain, Mr. Moman, the human replied. Our most recent information is from over a year ago, before the Battle of Katsa Plains. No merchants or envoys have arrived with news of the Draconic Kingdom's plight, to our knowledge. Meaning that she knew even less than they? Not that they knew very much more. Since they had been instructed to maintain their distance from the slain theocracy, Nazarik's knowledge of the Draconic Kingdom, which was a mere 50 kilometers across the northern end of an inland sea from the slain theocracy, was limited to what they could collect indirectly. They were situated beside a large country of beastman-type demi-humans, which was said to be one of the stronger countries on the continent. The Draconic Kingdom, which was populated by weak humans, became a convenient hunting ground as a result. Raids were frequent, and large-scale raids that could overrun entire cities were not unheard of. Eventually, those raids were turned away by a combination of adventurers and foreign military aid. This had been the state of affairs for as long as anyone could remember, so Albedo filed it away as a setting of sorts. Matters closer to home demanded their attention. Since their position was supposedly in the northwestern corner of a huge continent, it was best to focus on lands to the north and west first. Unfortunately, the people of this world had the gall to act on their own instead of waiting for their turn at the chopping block. Fortunately, their supreme overlord in his infinite wisdom had foreseen this and prepared all of the necessary pieces well in advance. Countess Corlin planned to enact a permanent solution to the Beastman problem, which would also secure an ally to the southeast that would act as a buffer state. That ally would also be the staging ground for further ventures that would project the Sorceress Kingdom's economic and political influence further abroad. Rather than recklessly rush into things, the human noblewoman had put together a comprehensive plan, which included advancements in logistics that would give the Sorceress Kingdom an undeniable edge in any economic arena. Once her preparations were complete, they would wait for news of the next Beastman incursion. The Draconic Kingdom usually sent envoys to the Baharuth Empire every time it happened. When it did, the Sorceress Kingdom would intervene. The Countess even suggested that the Empire could send help alongside them to create a sense of solidarity with their new suzerain and further improve the harmonious image of the Sorceress Kingdom. Little did they know that news would not arrive at all, or did they? Lady Corlin, Albedo said. I believe you have forged some ties in the Baharuth Empire. Did you speak with them about the Draconic Kingdom? In particular, the last time they received an envoy? I did, my lady, the Countess nodded. The last time the Empire received an envoy from the Draconic Kingdom was before the Battle of Katza Plains. Events surrounding the rise of the Sorceress Kingdom demanded their complete attention, so they turned the envoy away. The young noblewoman's amethyst eyes widened. Are you suggesting that this invasion has been going on for over 14 months? Corlin was smart enough to understand that her question needed no reply. A failure in communication? A blind spot? An oversight? No, it can't be considered any of that. For the Baharuth Empire, the plight of the Draconic Kingdom was insignificant compared to the Empire's immediate matters. They were not a client state of the Sorceress Kingdom at the time, so the Empire saw no need to report that an envoy had come. In the end, the desperate plea of a nation under siege had been buried and forgotten. Albedo shook her head. Not out of sympathy, but disdain. The circulation of information in their region of the world was laughably poor. Perhaps the foremost example was that of the Dwarf Kingdom in the Azalisia Mountains. Despite centuries of decline and open trade with the Empire the entire time, they couldn't secure support from a nation with its closest major city a mere 30 kilometers away from their valley farms. Never mind securing support, they never even told anyone what was going on. It was as if the entire world suffered from terminal levels of mass incompetence in the field of communications. Maybe some sort of strange environmental effect was influencing them. She would have to keep an eye on that. Is a war lasting over a year in this region of the world an extraordinary thing? Pandora's actor asked. Yes, Mr. Moman, Countess Corlin answered. Even for a country with a professional army like the Baharuth Empire, a war that lasts beyond a season would cause the nation's economy to buckle and collapse. Furthermore, protracted warfare is actively avoided due to the risk of creating negative energy wastelands or adding too much to existing ones. There are usually 1 to 3 decisive battles in a war before diplomacy is pursued. As far as I know, only the slain theocracy is capable of sustaining a war of the scale represented by this report. The Sorceress Kingdom as well, though I doubt we would ever need to. I see, Pandora's actor replied. In this case, we can only make the best of what we are presented with. At the risk of sounding callous, the Draconic Kingdom's unprecedented circumstances offer the Sorceress Kingdom an unprecedented opportunity. Beware those who may level those accusations at you while you're there. Creating connections and cultivating goodwill is our objective, Countess Corlin replied with a nod, so that much is a matter of course. Cultivating political goodwill while diminishing the slain theocracy's shadow over regional politics. The creation of a lucrative trade route to untapped markets, which would eventually reverse the plummeting price of the Sorceress Kingdom's commodity exports. A new customer for their undead security forces, a buffer for their southeastern border and a bridgehead to the world beyond. By human standards, Countess Corlin would be recognized as an overwhelmingly good individual. Enough to draw comparisons to heteromorphs like angels. Beyond that, she was not stupid. Early in the Duchy of Erantal's reorganization as the central territory of the Sorceress Kingdom, Albedo had identified the young noblewoman as a useful tool for the future. She was intelligent, industrious and charismatic, perfect for swaying local sentiment in the new administration's favor. Little did Albedo know how right she would be, or perhaps she had only grasped a small part of what their master had already identified out of the nobles who remained to manage their lands in his name. Albedo's wings rustled slightly as she recalled the day she had confidently delivered her assessment to Momonga, thinking her findings to be of some use to him. Not only did he demonstrate that he knew what was going on, but he had subtly chided Albedo for her attempt at eliminating Shultier's new human vassal. Now, those four that were discussed at that time were bearing fruit far beyond Albedo's predictions for them. She also saw the wisdom in the Supreme One's decision to give them to Shultier. As the Minister of Transportation, she would need capable and loyal servants to assist her, and the need for them was immediate. They also continued to help lay the groundwork for the Sorceress Kingdom as a whole, so their transfer under Shultier's authority did not affect what they did for the nation. The extent of the Countess' ambition, however, continued to be a surprise. She was not content with her domain and her new place in Shultier's court. By all appearances, she seemed entirely intent on accelerating Momonga's plans for world domination. "Are you still certain that you can still achieve the plan's objectives?" Albedo asked. "I'm reasonably certain, my lady," Countess Corlin answered. "Rather than success or failure, we should be considering it in degrees of success." It certainly did seem that way. There were problems, however. Ones that were not intrinsic to the plan itself, but in their target. "Can the turnaround time for the Draconic Kingdom's economy be minimized?" Albedo asked. "A quick recovery will prove a compelling demonstration for other parties. Our efforts in human countries, particularly in Riastais, continue to meet with stubborn, irrational resistance. That would depend on what we find there. These are already very tentative estimates. This is also an opportunity to retool the Draconic Kingdom's industries to be in line with the Sorceress Kingdom's policy objectives. Aside from undead labor, agricultural produce and goods derived from forestry are still our nation's principal exports. I do not believe that a nation would so readily give up their food security," Pandora's actor said. "I agree, Mr. Moman," the Countess said, "but whether they are or aren't willing is not an obstacle. Since we are facing a severe shortage of low-level undead laborers anyway, they will not enjoy the low costs of food production that we do. The markets will dictate how they allocate their remaining labor to industry. Perhaps some of their administrators will remain irrationally stubborn about it, but that is their loss. Most will aim to produce what our markets demand. The Sorceress Kingdom's economic policy will dictate the course of their industry." In short, despite the scope of Countess Corlin's ambitions, she was leaving ultimate power in the hands of the royal court. It was a statement that she knew her place and would happily employ her talents in service of the Sorcerer King. Their domestic policies were already decided on until winter. Rather than undertake any disruptive changes to its industries, the duchy's production would be left to the local leaders. By Albedo's estimates, it would take another 4 or 5 years to stabilize at their current pace of integration. At that point, she could more decisively nudge things in whatever direction she deemed appropriate. "That decision will have to wait until next year when we have more data to work with," Albedo said. "Securing trade agreements and official testimonies in support of the Sorceress Kingdom's exports is the priority for now. The Minister of Foreign Affairs will likely have something to add once I brief him." "What is the Sorceress Kingdom's decision on how far are we allowed to go in regards to technical expertise and material support?" "Keep things at a reasonable minimum, for now," Albedo replied. "I have found that the local humans have an unpleasant tendency to reach for more than they deserve if they are shown even the slightest bit of generosity or favor. What we offer in the long term will depend on their cooperation and the industrial data we collect. The Sorceress Kingdom is not a charity." "Of course, my lady," Lady Corlin nodded. "What of the Beastman Kingdom?" "Do not exceed the limits outlined by our foreign lease agreements and our foreign policy. Demonstrate their full effectiveness against the invaders." A smooth interplay between Albedo and Countess Corlin ensued as they finalized each point in the plan. She could only wish that interactions with her human agents could be so seamless. For some stupid reason, many humans believed they could get by on a bare minimum of familiarity with a subject and fumble their way through the rest. Sifting through it all was an onerous and infuriating affair. Even for those with passable levels of competence, there was always something in the way. Self-interest, conflicting agendas and drastically different perspectives plagued her ongoing efforts to prepare for Riasti's eventual membership as a client state of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Learning how to utilize the mortals of this world for economic gain, however, was undoubtedly of great benefit. For the most part, their expectations and desires were laughably small-minded, but the revenues garnered from their endless pursuit of profit resulted in an ever-growing source of Yggdrasil gold coins. Rather than conquest and destruction for short-term gains, their master chose to establish a consistent flow of resources into Nazaric's coffers. Every harvest that passed, every caravan that went through customs, every new industry that paid taxes, those under their influence worked to fund Nazaric's defenses, allowing them to summon more and more powerful mercenary NPCs to combat future threats from players and other unknown powers of a similar magnitude. In the end, Albedo voiced her official go-ahead. After the young noblewoman departed the hall, Albedo looked back down at the map she had left with them. A civilian mindset, Albedo looked up from the table. What was that? Something I hear once in a while, Pandora's actor said. There are certain linchpins in this plan that Countess Corlin is not accounting for properly. It appears well-rounded, to me, Albedo replied. I have been working with her on this for the last year, you know. Perhaps I put it too harshly, the doppelganger admitted. This scenario is framed in such a way that it tests what our local collaborators can do with the means that would be regularly provided to them. But there are places where even the utmost vigilance will fail them. I believe that is where we should step in, as it is an opportunity to reinforce the notion that power far greater than their own supports them in their endeavors. An extra weapon in our diplomatic arsenal, so to speak. What are you proposing? Albedo asked. A guarantee. Pandora's actor placed his palm on top of the map. Assuming she's still alive, the Draconic Kingdom's head of state needs to be secured. At the same time, she cannot leave her country. A squad of Death Knights is insufficient to protect Queen Auriculus against a probable worst-case scenario, and their presence may hamper our diplomatic efforts. Additionally, losing her while she is under our protection will be a crippling blow to the Sorceress Kingdom's prestige. One of us should go. It was true that Albedo was the best tank out of Nazaric's NPCs, but it would hardly do for her to leave her post as Prime Minister. She could imagine all the absurdities that would conveniently crop up while she was away. You mean to go as Moman, then? No, Pandora's actor chuckled. Our goal is to have Moman's fame gradually diminish relative to the Sorcerer King's, so it would hardly do to build it up even further. We already have a fine gentleman who is a perfect fit for the job.